Thank you all for joining us for the How to Publish Your Thesis or Dissertation workshop. Joining us today are Dr. Sarah Jordan, Program Director of Couple and Family Therapy, and Dr. Tony Rapetti, Interim Chair and Associate Professor for Hospitality. So they're going to be answering your questions, any questions you have about how you can publish your thesis and dissertation. So I'm going to hand it over to them first for introductions, and then we will begin taking questions. Dr. Jordan, you want to start us off?
Sure. I wish I was really at the beach. You'll see my background. Um, it's nice to meet all of you. And I have been at UNLV for 2.5 years. I was previously at Texas Tech University for 12 years. I have to remember how long it was. And I worked in a doctoral. We had a doctoral and a master program there, and couple and family therapy. And here we have a master's program. So I can give you some background from either publishing your thesis or your dissertation. So I've had experiences with working with students with both. So it's nice to be here.
Great. So I'm Dr. Tony Rapetti. I'm in the hospitality program, as Nev said. I have been at UNLV at the professor level for 8 years. I was at UCF for a year prior. I did get my doctorate here before leaving and coming back. I come from a background of, prior to this, I had a career in industry, in the industry in which I teach. So I was a corporate director of finance for many years in the gaming industry. So all of the programs that I have been at, both here and at UCF, have been undergrad, graduate, both master's and doctoral programs. And so I've been involved in all of those. So I'm looking forward to answering any questions.
Thank you both. So to start us off, as we are writing our thesis or our dissertation, are there things that we should be thinking about if we are interested in publishing? So for example, format, structure, anything else?
Sure. So I can go first. I'm going to say not so much with format and structure, because depending on where you're going to publish, the dissertation and thesis is a completely different paper than what you're going to publish in a journal. So because of that, I hate to tell you, but it's going to have to be rewritten for a publication. So my dissertation, as an example, was 120 or 40 something pages, right? You're not going to get that when you publish for an article. So it's going to be much more condensed. So you're going to have to rewrite it anyway. Now, that being said, most of our fields, so in my field, we write in the college in APA, and most of our publications are in APA. That's not 100% what happens, but I don't have a choice. So the college requires APA. When I go out for publication, I have to do what the journal does. So there's what we would consider a tier 1 journal that does not take APA. So I have to modify that later. For my field, the structure is very similar. We call it sort of a 5-chapter with an introduction, a literature review, a methodology, a results, and a discussion. That's pretty typical in our field. So that formatting structure will be the same for your dissertation as it would be for publication, unless you're doing a 3-paper. And if I know, Sarah will probably talk a little bit, because I think that's more common in her field, but we do have some doing it in ours, but even the 3-paper in ours still follows roughly that same structure. But yeah, I mean, from a formatting or structure perspective, I think that you really have to do it all over again, unfortunately, when you go to publication.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, that's interesting because, a traditional dissertation thesis is like what Tony said, very long. You have to cut it down, and it's a lot of work. It was about, I guess, when I was a doc, I graduated in 2006 from Virginia Tech, and I think they were just starting to talk about and think about in certain disciplines where you could have alternative dissertation formats. And so by the time I got to Texas Tech, everybody did traditional dissertation until about maybe 8 years ago or so. And then the university and the college gave the option of doing traditional format or a 3-article format. Now, I sat on a committee once in biology where they had a 5-article format. So I think the number of articles for the dissertation could vary by discipline. I've seen 2 variations of that. I think it's much more practical for the student to choose a multi-article format because it gives you a leg up on trying to publish your dissertation, that is. For thesis, I don't know that that's an option to do a multi-paper, maybe some disciplines it is. I've just seen it more likely in the dissertation. The thing you want to be aware of, though, that I have seen with proposals, at least, we've had to kind of committees that I've sat on, is that sometimes when people do actually, we had a 3-article format. One's like a theory, and then 2 articles that were quantitative or empirically based. So what I had seen or have seen sitting on some committees, that students will copy and paste information from article 1 to article 3, or from 2 to 3. And that's plagiarism in terms of, if you were to go publish these articles, you can't have the same content, even though you're the author for both, because they're being published in different journals, I'm assuming. So that was one word of caution. A lot of times students would also do the 3-article format, and they'd really stretch it too thin. So it really was one study, and they try to make 2 studies out of it. It would be best to publish as one study. So that's something you want to rely on your advisor on to see what's going to be best for your study and your career goals. Traditionally, people that go in academic job markets, this is who that would be fitting for, to do a 3-article format or however many article format that fits your discipline. I would encourage that, actually. If you are working on a thesis and you probably don't have that option, then you would do traditional format. If you want to go on for PhD and publish your thesis as part of your doctoral work, I think that's a great idea too. In terms of authorship, you want to check with those on your committee from your thesis to see who is going to work with you and stay on the article. When I published my thesis, I assumed that because people were on the committee that for my thesis that they would be co-authors, and that's not, according to discipline, all that, not necessarily the case. So you always want to check with those authors to see if they're going to be on your submitted article from your thesis. I think that, unless there's other questions, the general process for publication, is that okay, Nev, if I jump to that question okay, because it kind of ties with this. So, in general, and it has changed even since I've been a professor, but in general, articles submitted for publications are usually in peer-reviewed journals, which means you submit your article to usually through a website. Some of the smaller journals still do email submissions, but usually through a website. And you want to make sure that it's blind. And I'm an editor, so I get this all the time. And a blind submission means that the peer review process is supposed to be double blind. So the reviewers don't know who I am, and I don't know who the reviewers are. That ensures that it's they can give me comments, and I can give comments back without being concerned about who these people are that are reviewing my paper. So when you submit online, you'll want to make sure that you've taken out your name, affiliation, those types of things that would be identifying markers. If you're doing research like in a university clinic or something, you would want to take out that name and say something like in your document, like a mental health facility in the southwest part of the US, or something very vague, so they can't identify you. But if the region of the country informs your study, you would want to provide at least that information. So the process is that first of all, you always want to work with your advisor, your chair of your thesis or dissertation, and talk about authorship and roles. You want to decide that right up front, because that can be sticky. If you say, well, I'm going to be first author, that means you're going to do more work than the second author, and then somehow you don't do as much work, and then so you want to negotiate the order of authorship early on. You work with your co-authors to put your paper together. It's very common that, common practice is that the student would be first author and the chair would be second author, unless there's an exception for that. And then other committees could join as other second or third, fourth, or fifth authors if they're willing to help with the paper. So you would submit your paper, and this is a general submission process, a blind paper. It goes out for peer review. The editor selects 2 to 3 reviewers. They take, depending on the journal, a month to 6 months perhaps to review your paper. Usually it's supposed to be about 6 to 8 weeks, but that doesn't always happen. And then the editor will make a decision, and it's either flat out reject, like this paper doesn't fit, here's some recommendations, send it somewhere else. Most commonly a revise and resubmit, which means here are the reviewer comments that they would like you to address, changes they'd like you to make, and then it's up to you whether you make those changes or not. So you don't have to make all the changes that the reviewer suggests, but you have to give a reason for why you don't and give a rationale for why you won't make that change. So you make the revisions, then you submit it back to the journal. And then either they send it back out for peer review, or depending on the number of suggestions or how clean the paper is, perhaps the editor may just review your revisions and render a decision of accept. A conditional accept means it's accepted with the condition that you make the specific change. So if you're not willing to make that change in your paper, usually it's a small thing, then it's not accepted. Accept is it's accepted as is, and then it goes to the copy editing process where they clean your paper, make sure your references match the text in your paper, the citations, clarify any errors that are in the paper, and that is done usually at the publishing level for most journals. And then you get proofs, which are usually sent to you very quickly, like, hey, your paper's almost ready for publication. We need this back in 3 days. Here are all the queries from the copy editor. Sometimes it's that quick of a turnaround to make it into the next issue because they have cycle deadlines for their issues. And then you would make those changes, and then your journal would be published. Most journals now have an early preview version where you can see it online before it's officially published in the issue number. And for those journals that still send out hard copy issues of their journals, that would be the final. So let's say the early view of your article is online in March, everybody can access the PDF, but July is when the paper copy, the hard copy of the journal, is mailed out to people. I know that was a lot of information, so I don't if Tony wants to jump in, that would be great. But that's kind of an overview of the cycle of that process.
No, you hit it. I don't think you missed anything.
Thank you. So we did get another question in the chat. For my MED program, I will be completing an electronic portfolio rather than a thesis. Could I still submit articles for publications without having published a thesis, or is this atypical?
So I'll address it because I come from my master's is actually a business degree, which does not do theses either. So when I did my business degree here at the university, they do pro papers, but not everybody does pro papers either. I did business plans. That was definitely not publishable because we were building a business. So I really think it depends on what your intention is. Not all master's programs, the intention is that you get a published article out of it. So I think you said it was a electronic portfolio. I don't know why that would be published, why you would be looking at getting that published. So I don't think you would go that route. Now, the next part of the question you said is, could I submit it without a thesis? Absolutely. I mean, you can, we have master's students that, for instance, maybe do pro papers. So those are generally not publishable because they're not, at least in our field, they're not doing the empirical research, but they may work on other papers that are published in different topics. So they're not one and the same. You could get publications that are not based on your culminating paper. You just have to see what is necessary. Some culminating experiences, again, I don't know that an electronic portfolio would do that, but some culminating experiences might be publishable, but not academically publishable. So maybe they're white papers or trade journal articles, which are still very valuable to the industry, but they're not double-blind peer reviewed. They're not, they may not have empirical research on them, but still very important. So you may get those out of your master's degree. And I'll also tell you, while the intention of your thesis is to get a publication, in my field specifically, not all of our master's students that do a thesis go on to a PhD. So the publishing aspect from their perspective is not as important as those that go on to a PhD. Obviously, if you get a PhD, your intention is to get some publications out of that. In our field, we sort of look for, 2 to 3 publications out of a dissertation, or at least the stream of research in the dissertation. But I have sat on one dissertation off the top of my head that I can think of right now that never got published and probably never will. Doesn't mean it wasn't good. That person is in industry, the publication is not real important to them. And the dissertation process, it is just that, a process. And that sometimes you go through all of that and your results don't come out to be anything significant, hence may not be publishable. Doesn't mean you didn't get your dissertation done. It just means it may not be publishable. That is not generally what you hope to happen, especially if you're going into the academic field, but it does happen. Sarah, you want to add anything?
Yes. So I think it depends on the discipline. So for us, we do portfolios at the master's level. Our thesis is optional. About 10% of our students do theses. The other 90% either do a clinical or a research capstone, their culminating experience, which is kind of like this completing electronic portfolio. It'd probably be very similar. So for those that do research, those that work with me, I give them the option. They can either work on a project and put together like all the materials that they did for the research project, or I've had 2 students, I said, hey, would you like to put together a presentation or a publishable paper? And so I've had a few students who we write actually a theory-based paper and submit it for publication, and that is their portfolio. So I think it depends on the program and the advisor. So we give a lot of wiggle room. Their portfolio could be lots of different things. I think it's an option, and I think the other thing is, like Tony said, it depends on your field and your goals. If you're not going into academia and your field doesn't usually have a lot of people published at the master's level, there's really not a need for that. But if a student wants to do that, I think to talk to your advisor to see what that might look like. Because I never want to discourage anyone from doing that, but it may not be the best practical thing for their career goals. So.
Thank you. So we have another question. Do we generally have to submit a anonymized version of our data so that they can duplicate the research?
It depends. So in our field, that is not common in hospitality. I'm at 26 or 27 publications, and I have never been asked for my data. We are seeing a trend, though, in our field where some journals are asking for it so that others could do it. They may not be requiring it. So again, I think it depends on your field. I don't know what's common in Sarah's fields.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we work with human subjects. We have to get IRB approval to collect most of our research as human subjects approved. Now, the research that I do is a little bit different, and it's not because it's publicly available data. We do, some of our projects are. So because if you have human subjects, you're asking, the university for permission to do research. If you were then to share that data, that can get a little tricky. I've never been asked for my data set before, but I've been asked for like the manual that I use to analyze, those types of things. It's not usually common to share your blind data with other people unless you're working with them as co-authors on another project. I only know of one story where, very odd, very rare, but someone received NIH funding and conducted a large grant funded study, and falsified the data. And somehow they were caught. And I don't know how they were caught, but it was a bad situation. And so anyone who had cited that particular study had to retract is very, very messy, complicated situation. So you don't usually have those situations where you're sharing data or that people would check things or that sort of thing. But it's more of an ethical, making sure that you have analyzed the data appropriately. Again, I've never had anybody ask me for a copy of my data set to check things or to use it for something else.
And I just want to also do a follow-up. It sort of stems from that. I think what's more common is because we can't a lot of times share our data that we've primarily collected because of IRB, it is not uncommon for a journal to ask for your instrument. So they want to see the survey. Some don't. So I have done surveys where they do not want to know the survey. I mean, they can tell by how we analyze it, what the questions are. And then I have had other journals that want the full-blown survey as an appendix. And so you may get that more than really just the data, because that will also tell them if it is reliable and generalizable. And so you might get that more than the data side of it.
So our next chat question is, a friend of mine who is a director of communications in a corporate company told me that the maximum length of a sentence should be about 25 words. Is there such unspoken rules for sentence or paragraph length in publications?
I was just pulling out my handy dandy Chicago Manual of Style, laminated. Oh gosh, I can't see it very well. Okay. So anyways, I'll put the name of it in the chat box, but I am an editor of a journal. And so I have this laminated, folded out. I think the price is $7. And if you adhere to Chicago Manual of Style, it talks about how to prepare a manuscript, copyright, all the general things that you would need for publishing. It's like a quick and dirty guide. It's like basically 6 pages worth of information. I think this would be helpful to get as someone who's not published before or new to publishing. It's a very quick read. It gives you lots of notes, and it talks about style and things. I'm not aware of the 25 word thing, but it would be in the Chicago Manual of Style, the details of that. It's not in my quick guide, but I'll put the name of that. And I got mine on Amazon. Like I said, it's laminated. It sits on my desk. I can pull it out for reference.
Yeah, I have also never seen that. Obviously, almost every journal has a word count for the article itself. So it will say, maximum 7,000 or 9,000 words, including or excluding references, just depending on the journal. They usually have a word count in the title. At least that I've seen, they ask that the title be, no more than 8 words or something like that. Sometimes they're a little loose with that, that they say 8 and then they might give you till 10 or whatever. But I have never seen one in so we follow APA, and a modified Harvard are the 2 most common in our fields. And I have never seen a limit. No journal I've ever published in has had a limit in sentence or paragraphs. The limit has always been in the article overall. That being said, you want good, you don't want your sentences to go on too long to where your reader doesn't understand the breaks and what's going on. But I wouldn't say there's a rule to it.
Thank you. So we have someone that is wondering so we don't get paid for publishing. Is the whole process just for name recognition?
Well, if you're like Sarah and I, and you're paid by the university, you really do get paid to publish. I mean, it's part of my job. So if I do not publish, so we go through an evaluation process as an academic. I'm required to publish in our college 2 a year. We do a rolling 3-year evaluation, so 6 every 3 years. And if I do not publish that, we are required to take on more courses to teach. So in essence, I do get paid to publish. But if I were to publish 4 in any given year, do I get a bonus? No. And if I publish, let's say in one particular term, I have 4 instead of 6, then I have to pick up an extra class for the other year until I get caught back up to that 6. So that's part of it. The other part you asked if it's brand recognition, absolutely. That's part of when you go up for your promotion and tenure. That's what you're building, is you're building who you are and an expert in a field. And so the more you publish, the more you're being known for that recognition of who you are.
So just to add to that, our field is the same. Like Tony said, there's the expectation to publish. However, when I was at Texas Tech, I had a colleague in business, and she said in their school of business, if they published a paper, they got like a $5,000 bonus. Now, I have never heard of that before, but she told me that that's what they did in their business school. So I guess it's very rare. I would not expect it, but I guess if you're in an academic institution where, and I asked her about that, I said, wow, that's pretty cool. You know, she said the reason is because in her particular area, it's very hard to get any kind of publication out there. And so if they get a publication, they get a bonus. The other like publication types that you would get compensated for would be books, like royalties off of books. It's not very much unless you have a bestseller. But in the academic world, if you're writing for, I have one book that's co-authored. I get like a, $70 check every few months or whatever. It's not much at all, if that. And those are royalties from books. So you're not going to make your living off it. However, I will share my mentor. She's a communication person. She wrote a very, very famous book back in the 60s, and she was able to, she was 19 when she started co-writing this book. She was able to go to graduate school off the royalties off this book. That's how popular the book was. So that's very rare you would be in that type of situation. But some people, that's what they do out in the non-academic world, is they write books, and they make money that way. But usually for academics, it's based on your work performance. Like Tony said, ours is like, if it's not necessarily you would have to teach more, but you wouldn't get promoted or you wouldn't get tenure if you didn't meet the kind of the, standard for, how many to publish each year.
Thank you. So you've touched a bit about articles, but what are some other different options that you have for publishing either your thesis or dissertation? So let's say books or chapters. Are there any strengths and weaknesses with each?
So I think some of it goes back to what we talked about originally, which is what's your intention, right? So if your intention is to go into academia, then you need to go for that peer-reviewed publication. That should be your first shot. Because that's really all you're going to get credit for if you're looking for a job or you're going up for tenure, is that peer-reviewed double-blind, publication. Now, if that's not what you're looking for, or if you're in a school that is not a research institution, so there are a lot of hospitality programs that would not be considered research institutions, and so they teach more. For them, the value is that name recognition. So, does a local industry know you? And so trade journals, white papers, presentations, guest speaking, to organizations, those are all very valuable to the industry, training, things like that. So those are ways to get your research out there. But it's the non-academic track. Some of my papers I have actually published academically, and then also published newspaper articles or white paper articles on, to sort of because in our field, industry doesn't read our academic papers, and we are in an applied field. So a lot of times our results don't get disseminated out to them because they don't even have access to the peer-reviewed stuff. So we do white papers or trade journals. So I've written a 1,000-word trade article, right, to get the results out there. That really just concentrates on the results section and the significance of it. It has nothing to do with a lit review. It doesn't talk about methodology. It's just, here's what we did, here's what we found, and here's why it's important. So it really, and that gets industry the information. We get no credit as an academic, at least in my college, for doing things like that. But your name is out there now, and if they need research done in the field, they're like, oh, I remember so-and-so. And I get a lot of people that'll be like, I saw your article on this. Can you talk more about this thing that's going on? And so you'll get some of those.
Yeah, a lot of similarities. If you are a student and for either your graduate assistantship or whatever reason, a faculty member says, hey, I've been invited to write a book chapter. Would you like to co-author with me? Say yes, because those, as a student, to have any kind of publication, it means something, whether you're going from master's to PhD or PhD to your first job. So I think at different stages of your career, when you're a student, any publication matters, just to show that you're going above and beyond what happens in the classroom. When you get to an academic position, it depends on the institution. And again, what Tony said, what they focus on. A lot of times for like book chapters in our field, they will, if you have an expertise in something, they will ask, you'll be invited to do that. So I've been invited to do a solution focused brief therapy is the type of therapy that I use. So if there's a book on that, sometimes I'll get invited to write a book chapter. So the more that you publish peer review articles, the more likely your name is out there as an expert that you'll be asked to write, book chapters on. You don't get any proceeds for those because they're just book chapters. You may get a free copy of the book if you're lucky, if you're the first author. But they're great ways to bring graduate students on to give them experience. I know that happened for me as a grad student. I was able to write several book chapters with faculty members to give me writing experience and publishing experience. Another way to get a good publication if you're a student, because like I said, any is good, is to do a book review. So a lot of journals in our field at least, I don't know about other fields, but sometimes they have sections about a book review. So they usually ask doc students to do these. I've been a book review editor for a journal in the past. And so I would reach out to a doc student, say, hey, I have this book that needs to be reviewed. Here are you have to write 3 to 5 pages. I will edit it for you. And then you will get a publication in this particular journal. So that's a great way for graduate students to kind of up their publications, is to do a book review. And it is a publication, but it's not peer reviewed. It is invited. But those are opportunities to kind of look for.
So we have another question here. If I go with 3 paper structure for the dissertation, then how can I choose these 3 papers? Does it have to be published already at the time of the dissertation submission, or is it okay with just under review or submitted?
So normally when people are doing a 3-article format, that's kind of their first draft in a sense. I mean, the committee works with them to do their defense, but it's not typical for someone to submit the publication, at least in our field, at the time of the defense. Now, some disciplines, they do. They actually have to submit the paper to a journal, or it has to be accepted. That's not what we do in our field, but some fields may do that.
Yeah, and we don't do a lot of them, but the intention is that you get out of it with 3 publications. So some people write their first publication and it's already been published or accepted, and then they go on to write their next 2 in their dissertation. Some don't have any, and that maybe they're all in some stage of a review process. I think it's important to make sure, if you're going to go that route, that all 3 of those need to have a connection to each other. They are not 3 separate articles. So they are 3 articles on a similar topic that can be connected in some way, shape, or form to a bigger topic. So it really just depends on where you are in the structure, but I don't believe there's anything that says they have to be one or any have to be published, but the intention is that they will have been, I believe, at least one of them submitted along the process. Probably all of them by the time you did your dissertation. May not be accepted, but again, I've not worked on one of those. And so I couldn't answer that 100%.
So do we generally submit the same paper to multiple journals? And if one of them accepted, do you have to tell the rest to stop considering it or publish in multiple journals? How do we resolve that?
I'll jump in, like my skin is crawling. So I know, because it's not something that we talk about, but it's kind of an understood rule. And I'm really glad this question is asked, because they're really, really important when it comes to copyright. So when you submit to a journal, you're being considered for that journal. If you decide that you'd rather publish somewhere else, you have to withdraw that article from the initial journal before you can submit it. You would never submit the same paper to multiple journals. Now you're like, well, that's going to take forever, because what if I send it over here and they don't like it? Then I got to start all over. Yes. So unfortunately, that's why the process is so long. And sometimes people will submit a paper to 2 or 3 different journals, but never at the same time. You do it one at a time. We had a journal once where the editor was just unresponsive, and I was co-authoring, and the student, it was like 9 months, no word from the editor. The editor kind of went MIA, and I said, for your sake, you need to withdraw that paper and take it somewhere else, because you can't just keep waiting. And so as long as you send an email to the editor, wherever the contact is, and say, I am formally withdrawing this manuscript, then you're able to submit it somewhere else. And you have record of that. Otherwise, they could say, wait a minute, you're breaking copyright. You're sending the same thing to more than one place.
Yeah, and I'll do a follow-up. Again, in my field, when you submit an article, there's a checkbox that says this has not been submitted anywhere else for publication. So you have to sort of acknowledge that when you're submitting. You also got to be very careful with publications and presentations. So in my field, you can do a presentation first and then a publication. But once it's submitted to a publication, if you then try to say, okay, now we're going to present it, it's considered like that's backwards. You have to do a presentation first. Once it's submitted to a paper for review, you pretty much have to hold off. There's nothing else you can do with that until you hear from them. And to follow up with Sarah's, I actually did have a paper that was sit with a journal for 9 months. It was January of last year through September, and I emailed 4 different times and got 0 response. And I literally was like, okay, I have got to get this moving. And so I knew someone who was on the editorial board who was a good friend. And I reached out to them and said, listen, I am not getting a response from the editor. I will gladly pull this paper and submit it somewhere else. But if it's going to be revision and let me redo it, I don't want to waste that time. So would you please just follow up to see where it is? Like, I understand that COVID hit, but this really should have been done before COVID hit. And so they were able to, get with the editor. For some reason, they got a response. I didn't. It ended up being accepted, but I was at a point where I was ready to pull it because I could not submit it elsewhere. It was stuck with them until they either gave me an answer or like Sarah said, I had to pull it. And literally, it took everything in me. I was 9 months into this paper. I was like, I can't resubmit. Like, that's another 3-month process just for the first review. And, but it's the world that we live in with publications, is that once we sort of commit to a journal, we're stuck with them until their process. And that leads into, keep that in mind when you go to submit again. Is that the type of journal you want to go to? So this journal that I'm talking about, I have had now 2 issues with. Both times I've been published, but I'm very hesitant to submit again because of the issues I have had. And so that's something you'll have to think about if that's where you want to be publishing your stuff.
Yeah, you're really at the mercy. In fact, the story about the 9 months, I'm actually the editor of that journal because the editor just it was an international journal. And so you're really at the mercy of the editor in the editorial's office. And I have former students all the time. It's been 6 months. I haven't heard anything. I was like, okay, well, and they're like, I've emailed 4 times. I'm like, okay, you have to decide for your career and all the other pieces, that particular article, the journal that is it worth continuing to hold out? Or are you on a timeline and do you need to pull it? And those are hard decisions to make, but you can talk to your advisor. If you graduated, your former advisor, other colleagues about advice on, the one I mentioned that I'm now the editor for that journal. We did the same thing. We were at a conference. We went to somebody on the editorial board, and I was on the editorial board too. But like, hey, can you? I had people call me. The editor literally went MIA, and people were trying to contact him, and no response. And he's in Australia, and we're in the U.S. And so you have to make that decision about what's best for it. And then actually, the funny thing is, she said, "Okay, we're going to withdraw the manuscript." He said, "Oh, I just got your email. I'm actually sending it out right now." And then crickets for 3 more months. And I was like, are you kidding me? So we share these stories because they're the reality of the publishing world. editors are doing 3 and 4 jobs. Just usually they're academics, they have a full-time job, they're doing this on the side. And smaller journals, especially, sometimes that it just takes them longer because they have a smaller editorial board and those types of things.
So our next question here in the chat is, what's the biggest challenge to publish a thesis? Do we have to use an innovative method or get an extraordinary result to get our research published?
So in my opinion, the biggest challenge, you have to have a research question that means something to the field that you're doing that in. I often struggle in our field because some journals do want the most advanced statistical method and they want the fancy method. And for a while there, it was SEM. Like everybody was doing SEM. I'm like, if I have to review another SEM paper, I'm going to scream, right? But that's all they were publishing was SEM. I take the side of, you need to use the method that answers your question, right? Now, that might be a descriptive. Now, then the question is that descriptive information really important to industry? So what, in my opinion, what gets it published is the question important to the field, and is it innovative to the field, right? It's not just replicating something in the past, it's bringing something new to the field, and it has a method that meets what you are trying to answer. Not necessarily, or it might be a new method to an old question to see if you get a different result. But that's going to depend again on the journal. So some journals will flat out say they do not take, descriptive information, or they don't, they're going to want more advanced statistical methods. Again, I believe that more important than the statistical method is the question. What's the research question? Is it important, and does it answer something that's valuable?
So in our field, and I think maybe this general statement would apply to most fields, but that we have like these top tier journals. So that means in any field, these are the kind of revered journals. These are the journals that the best studies are published in. Okay. Typically in most fields that tends to be quantitative, big studies where they get grant funding and think, not always, but those tend to be on the higher end of types of study. So the quality of your study, the rigor of your study, so that how solid your study, it really, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, whatever it is, if you have a sound study, your chances of it getting published somewhere are much higher. So students come to me and they say, I really want to do this new cool methodology for my dissertation. And my methodology that I use is very new and innovative. And it's hard to publish, to be honest, in some journals because it is so unique and not many people know how to do it, that people are like, what is this? We're not familiar with this, right? So I always ask students, what is your goal? What are those types of things you're looking for in your study? What is your research question? Like Tony said, you have to pick the method that best fits what your question is. A lot of times people will say, oh, I want to do SEM, so then I'm going to make up a question that fits with SEM. That's really backwards. You should do it the other way. This is my question. And your advisor says, oh, that's the phenomenology, qualitative methods. That would be great. Okay, that's what you do. But you also have to realize that in your particular field, some methods are revered more highlighted than others. Okay. So the more, like Tony said, the more advanced the quantitative statistic is, the more revered it is. That's just kind of a bias in a lot of fields. So you have to take that in consideration. But you can have a very solid, like if you're doing a qualitative study and, the experts in your qualitative methods say you need 10 to 20 subjects and you have like 25, that shows that you've got a good pool. If you have 9, that's going to be weaker in some ways, right? So the stronger your study is in terms of the actual study itself, how diverse your sample is, those types of things will make it greater for you to publish. For my thesis, I did a experimental research design, which in our field is very unique. I had an opportunity to do a more solid type of methodology. And so I had a greater chance to publish in our top journal than perhaps a qualitative study. At that time, that was favored. And then for my dissertation, I did something very different. I developed an instrument because given my institution at that time and the resources available, I did not have the support to do another experimental study. When I was in my master's, I had advisors that would, it was a very involved study that would do the mentoring and the supervision and the training. I didn't have that at my dissertation. And I was kind of bummed. I was like, man, this dissertation is not going to be as good as the other one because I didn't have the resources there. And I had to be very creative and innovative as to, okay, so logically, if this is my area of expertise and I've done this study, what else would pair well and that I could build on in my academic career? So I guess what I'm saying is don't get discouraged if you can't do the big fancy methods for whatever reason. Find something that you really like that is solid in the methodology and then get it published. I mean, I think those are the key things. The other piece is writing, and that's kind of secondary because you can have help with the writing. But I know a lot of students that submit papers sometimes get rejected just because the writing is so poor that the editor's like, I can't even, it's too messy. I can't even deal with it. So that's something to consider too. If writing is a struggle for you, make sure that you have co-authors, make sure that you have other people read your paper that you trust, get feedback on the writing, because you don't want the reviewers to be distracted by the quote bad writing, that it just gets a flat out reject. And I think a lot of people are very self-conscious about their writing too. Don't be self-conscious. Write it down. That's how you get published. It's practice and it's a skill. And yes, some people are just better than others at it, but most people have to work really hard at their writing, and don't get scared by that. Just reach out and use the tools and resources available so that you can get the publication.
Thank you. So if I have a paper that's already published as part of a conference proceeding, but that paper is a short 2-page paper that is more like a proof of concept for my larger research, do I then need to go back to conference organizer to make sure I can publish my more complete research later with a journal?
No. So the short answer is no, as long as what you're publishing is significantly different than what you've published in the proceedings. And I would guess that because it's only 2 pages long, it's going to be significantly different. In our field, so this was something somebody did not tell me when I was a PhD student. I thought it was great to be published in conference proceedings. And then I learned very quickly that that actually can hinder you. If it's an abstract and they are publishing abstracts only in a conference proceeding, I would say do it. If they are publishing full papers, I would recommend you stay away from that. I consider a 2-page more like an abstract. But if you're doing a full-blown presentation, so one of the conferences has happened and it was a 20-minute stand-up. So it was a full paper. It wasn't a work in progress. And I published conference proceedings. Well, then it's considered published. You can't republish the same work again, unless it's significantly different. So just as a general kind of side note on that, be very careful with publishing conference proceedings. But again, I think because you're saying it's a 2-page, I think you're going to be okay because it's going to be significantly different.
And I would agree with Tony, and it's based by field too. We don't do a lot of, our conferences don't have a lot of opportunities to publish proceedings. At least in couple and family therapy. So that's not as much of an issue for us. I saw this other question. I know we're almost out of time about comprehensive lit review. You do your best to search the literature, and the reviewers will give you feedback as to whether you've missed big holes, because the reviewers most likely are going to be experts on that subject, and they're going to know about things that you don't know about or that are maybe missing. And they can say, hey, look at these references here. I think they could add to your paper. And that's part of the benefit of the peer review. You don't get dinged for that. You want to do as best of a search as you can. But with technology the way it is and Google Scholar, I mean, you all are far beyond us. We had to go to the library and pull the books off the shelves. And, you know, let's say our library only has 20% of the publications in the field. We were kind of screwed, you know, unless we had a library that could do interlibrary loan, then you got to wait 4 weeks for it to come in. So I guess what I'm saying is there's more literature out there, but you also have more access. So if you feel like you've done a thorough search on your topic for the lit review, I think you're pretty good. I would feel more confident these days than I would 20 years ago if I was in the same boat trying to make sure I covered that topic area. And the reviewers will give you feedback on that.
Yeah, I agree. They don't have a problem giving that feedback because normally what happens, so that you guys understand a little bit about the review process, normally the reviewers are experts in the area in which they're reviewing. So they are very familiar with the field in which you are publishing. And so they'll be able to say, okay, I think you're missing this or this. You know, sometimes I'm asked to review things that are peripherally. And so the lit review, I'm like, yeah, maybe I don't know if they're missing something. But then there's other times when I'm like, yeah, you missed the seminal work on this person. But it's not going to be a complete reject from me because they mentioned that, right? Or they missed it. It's going to be in the comments. Please go back and review, you know, and I give them the article names or I give them the author and the year. So don't worry too much about it. What you need to worry about is if you're missing big chunks and you're not able to tell your story and that your literature review isn't building adequately into your research. That's more the problem than missing one or two papers.
Yeah, that's probably one of the most common reviewer feedback comments is here's literature that you're missing. So that's a very common thing, and it's not that's not a negative thing. A fatal flaw would be if your methods are like something that's not salvageable, like your methods just have this huge gaping hole that you can't fix because you've already done the study. That's a fatal flaw. But you're missing a part in your, it's very common. It's probably one of the more common, like I said, reviewer feedback pieces of information. And it's great. That's what makes the paper stronger.
So before we wrap up, I just wanted to open it up for the panelists and ask if there are any general pieces of advice you'd like to leave us off with, or if there's anything you want to address that we did not already ask today.
I just have one idea. If you want to know more about the public, if you're going into academia, if that's your plan, and you want to know more about the publication process, contact several of your journals in your field and ask them if you can be a student reviewer. And so that gives you an opportunity to review a paper that review may not go to the author, but you get to see what other reviewers give as feedback and compare your feedback with theirs to see, am I on track? It really gives you a firsthand look of what the process is like. It kind of demystifies what it is and how the language in which reviewers use to give feedback. And it's just a great experience. You can put it on your CV, student reviewer for Journal of blah, blah, blah. And they may give you one paper, or if they really like you, I've heard some smaller journals will even ask doc students onto their editorial board at some point. So it's a good way to meet colleagues and stuff, but it really helps you understand the process, I think.
Yeah, and also I would, you know, when you work with your faculty, don't just work on your dissertation. If you're writing, you know, other papers, and ask them, can I see the comments you got? Not just, you know, okay, we're on this paper together. I've been asked to fix A, B, and C. Maybe just say, hey, can I see what the comments were? And then we can talk about what you address and what you don't address. And because the reviewers aren't always right. I mean, there are a lot of times that I look at reviewers and I'm like, yeah, I'm not changing that, right? Or I get conflicting because the reviewers also can't see each other's reviews until after the first revision. So I will sometimes get conflicting reviews and I have to decide which one can be addressed, because by addressing one, I could potentially be negating the other. I actually had that happen in this last paper where a reviewer asked me to change something. Or paper last year. I changed it. The next review came out. They loved it. The other reviewer was like, why did you change this? And I was like, okay, well, now what do I do? So I had to, you know, go to the editor and say, listen, you know, I'm not going to win, right? I cannot win in this situation. So I'm going to leave it like this because of X, Y, and Z. You're going to have to make the final decision of what you're going to do. And so don't just assume reviewers are always right. And I say that about for even your dissertation or your thesis. Just because your committee members tell you to change something doesn't mean they're right. You should absolutely listen to them. You should hear what they have to say. But if you feel strongly and you can back up why you did something, then this is your paper. This is your potential publication. And just make sure you can make an argument for it. And that would be the same for papers.
Thank you both so much. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us today and giving us all this valuable advice. So thank you again so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see everyone at the next workshop.
Great. Thanks. Have a great
Bye, everybody. Yeah, have a great week. Have a good semester.